Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about measures the governor approves and disapproves, and one he has yet to act on. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you looking for fair news coverage out of the nation's capital? Join the Center Square's editor-in-chief Dan McCaleb and DC Bureau Chief Casey Harper as they discuss all things coming out of Washington, D.C.
And as you said, I did a fact check on this because I really found it pretty misleading. Gas prices, yes, are down. But if you look at food prices, they increased.
No spin, just the news. Listen to the America in Focus podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. On Tuesday, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed a measure to prohibit tax dollars for libraries that ban books they deem inappropriate, becoming the first state in the nation to do so. Some say the decision should be left to parents. Andrew Hensel has that story.
House Bill 2789 requires Illinois libraries to adopt the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights if they want to receive state grants. According to the ALA, material cannot be removed for partisan or personal reasons. State Rep Adam Niemerg says what books are suitable for children should be left up to the parents.
Encroaches on parental rights. In my mind, it's parents have obligation to raise their children, not the public education system, not the government.
Secretary of State Alexi Giannoulias says parents will still have the final say on what their children will read.
The right and the responsibility to restrict their children's and only their children's access to library resources. In other words, you get to decide what's right for your children, but you don't get to make that decision for anyone else's.
Beginning next year, libraries that do not follow the new law will not receive state funding. I'm Andrew Hensel.
Legislation giving Ameren, Illinois, a monopoly on future high-voltage line construction in downstate service areas is apparently doomed. Kevin Bessler explains.
The General Assembly passed a bill giving the company the right of first refusal to build transmission lines. But Governor J.B. Pritzker says he plans to veto the measure.
Yes, I do. Well, it'll be, I'm sure, taken up or considered in November, so there's a lot of time this summer.
During debate, State Representative Ann Williams expressed concerns on what the legislation could do to energy bills.
If you have more competition, generally you keep rates down. Whether it's generation or whatever it might be, it's common sense that a monopoly is usually bad for consumers.
Ameren has testified in other states that the competitive bid process experienced cost overruns and construction delays. I'm Kevin Bessler.
The statute of limitations for state officials to go after COVID-19 fraud could be increased with a measure on the governor's desk. House Bill 3304 passed both chambers unanimously during spring session. It was sent to Governor J.B. Pritzker Friday. The measure increases the time officials have to go after COVID-19 related program fraud, like fraud in the Paycheck Protection Program and unemployment programs. Decatur Republican State Representative Dan Calkins said the tools are only useful if they're used. He said officials need to prosecute and claw back the fraudulently released tax dollars.
The unemployment fund is paid by an employer. And so when we have a deficit in our fund that raises the insurance premiums on our employers, this isn't right.
He said it's just one part of reflecting on the problems from the pandemic.
What really happened and why were we unprepared? Why did we have to go hire an outside firm, and how much money did we actually pay them?
Illinois lost nearly $2 billion in funds due to fraudulent unemployment claims. However, still unknown is the entire scope of all the fraud. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom, individualism, limited government. On these issues, conservatives and libertarians generally agree. But where do we disagree? Check out the Future of Freedom podcast for civil, reasoned conversations about some of today's most pressing topics. It's not a debate. Our goal is to provide the best arguments from either side of an issue. Then you decide. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you find your podcasts.
Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today, as usual, is Greg Bishop, our Illinois Capitol Bureau senior reporter and editor. We've got a name we haven't talked about in quite a while to lead this week's Illinois in Focus. A man named Bruce Rauner, former governor of Illinois, Republican governor of Illinois, predecessor to the current governor, J.B. Pritzker. He was back at the state capitol this week. Greg, first tell us about why he was at the state capitol, and then we'll get into some of the other things that he said.
Yeah, so every governor, except for Rod Blagojevich, for various reasons, has a portrait unveiling at the Illinois State Capitol. If you've ever been there, it's on the second floor. You just go up the stairs and you'll find the Hall of Governors. And that's where they've got these just wonderfully painted portraits of governors of the past. And several years ago, former Governor Pat Quinn unveiled his portraits, which, of course, Quinn was the governor before Rauner was. But, every portrait has its own character, has its own story. And the former one-term Republican governor, Bruce Rauner, he was there to unveil his on Monday morning. So we started the week at the Capitol with the unveiling of a portrait where the governor joked about how he could have had a stag beer in his hand or a glass of whiskey, and he dispelled myths that earlier versions of the painting had the scalps of his political adversaries. It was an interesting unveiling that the former governor had in the Hall of Governors earlier this week.
He joked, too, that he has more hair in the photo and is a few pounds lighter than when he was governor.
Yeah, he says when he was governor, he was working so hard for the people, he says. He lost a lot of weight, and now he's gained that weight back, and he's the artist definitely did a good service to give him a little bit more hair in the portrait. But there's some interesting dynamics here. His portrait's very simple. It's just him standing there against a bluish background. He's wearing a blazer, and he's got one hand in a pocket and another one out, as he said, in a pensive position. Then he pointed out, the one major thing of symbolism is the lapel he has. And it was just of the state of Illinois, a cutout of the state of Illinois. When you compare that to former Governor Pat Quinn's portrait, Quinn, he's portrayed as standing up at a desk, and behind him are all kinds of images. One's a picture that looks like from a bill signing. Something else looks like maybe a windmill of sorts, or just these different images behind Quinn. And if I recall, I remember being at the Quinn unveiling, and he talked about some of the imagery and what it meant to him. But Rauner, he was asked about the difference in paintings, and he kind of joked and said, he doesn't really think a portrait does much to really explain any one elected official's legacy.
And I can agree with that. One more portrait-related question before we jump into the policy issues he was asked about, Greg, and we'll be clear up front. He didn't want to talk politics, not too much. He did answer a couple of questions. The artist who painted Governor Rauner, if you just happened to walk by it, you didn't know that there was a portrait unveiling or anything like that, would you recognize Bruce Rauner? Clear that it's him?
Yes, I think it's very well a good representation of the former Republican governor.
So a couple of policy issues that he was asked about, Greg. One of the signature successes, at least one that he would say was a success of his 4 years in office, was the Invest in Kids School Choice Scholarship Program. There was a sunset date on that legislation, though, that got passed through the legislature as part of the budget and signed by Governor Rauner, and that is set to expire at the end of this year. There have been calls, and we've written about it, of course, at thecentersquare.com during the legislative session, after the legislative session, for it to be extended for years going forward. What did Governor Rauner, former Governor Rauner, have to say about that?
Yeah, and this was a program that he really spearheaded as part of a negotiation of changing the school funding formula in the state of Illinois. The formula the state uses to give state tax dollars to local school districts. And that negotiation produced this Invest in Kids School Scholarship Program. And it gives a 75% Illinois state income tax credit for private donors who put into a fund, and those funds are granted to families that want to send their kid to a school of their choice. So he really talked that up even during the portrait unveiling. And afterwards, I asked him about his thoughts on the legislature yet to update that. And he said it would be a real disservice to these families who were taking advantage of it to be able to get their kids into a school of their choice. Now, he wasn't asked many questions after the unveiling, because he quickly Monday answered one political question saying he was not going to talk politics. He was out, just for the portrait unveiling, and he would be more than happy to be back in Springfield in September when he says he comes every year for dove season. He's happy to sit down and have lunch and talk politics then, joking that there's a lot going on nationally and across the state. So he is willing to have those conversations, but for whatever reason, Monday was not that day. But he was also asked, not just about the Invest in Kids program, where he did talk about how he wants that to be extended, and it would be sad if it wasn't. Somebody else asked what it's like to have 8 credit rating upgrades since you left office. Rauner laughed and he said, bond rating agencies love tax hikes and federal bailouts. Pretty much all of the politics that he talked about.
Was that sort of, I assume he didn't name drop Governor Pritzker when he mentioned the tax hikes, but Governor Pritzker, in his first couple of years in office, enacted a number of different tax hikes, doubling the state gas tax, adding an annual increase that does not have to be approved by the legislature. Pritzker, again, an annual tax increase tied to inflation, significantly reduced things like license plate renewal fees. Did you take that as a jab at the current governor?
I'm not sure how else to interpret that other than a recognition of the tax increases that have come into place since Pritzker took office, the doubling of the gas tax and the annual increase and so on. And, property taxes still have not really been dealt with. When it comes to the federal bailouts, Pritzker was governor during the COVID-19 situation where the state of Illinois, both public and private sectors, got $160 billion. So I'm not sure how else other to take it than to see it as the former governor reflecting on the current governor's handling of the state's finances.
Unlike some former governors, Pat Quinn, as you referenced earlier, Governor Rauner has really kept a low profile since leaving office. I could be wrong, but I think this is the first time he was back at the state capitol where journalists, reporters like yourself had an opportunity to see him and to talk to him. I certainly hope he sticks to his word and he does come back in the fall. He was going to do some hunting, right? Is that what he lives in Florida now? Let's just make sure our listeners know that. He relocated to the state of Florida, hasn't been in Illinois much, hasn't made many public appearances. He's coming back to hunt. Is that what he said?
Dove hunting. He loves Central Illinois' hunting grounds, and he says he knows some farmers in the area, and he's ready to have a pizza party to get together and party with people before dove season starts up. So we'll keep our emails open for if the former governor's staff wants to reach out and let us know. We'll be there and definitely want to ask him all kinds of different political questions. That's a promise he made. So we'll take a look at what happens in September.
I hope he certainly does, and I hope he does agree to sit down with us and other reporters. Like to hear how he thinks Illinois is doing right now. And
I will say they did relocate to Florida, but the former governor was sure to note that his wife Diana is very active with nonprofit groups in Chicago, as is the governor down in Florida. He talked about different projects that are coming about with a different system of higher education that he's looking to announce here soon, with several other various people that are involved in putting that together. He also discussed how he's somewhat active in politics down in Florida, and at least the Republican Party. So while he's kept a low profile mostly publicly, he says he's still been pretty active, but also spending a lot of time traveling the country with his grandkids.
Let's move on, though, Greg. During the recently adjourned legislative session, the General Assembly passed and Governor Pritzker signed legislation that would essentially take state funding away from libraries across the state, both regular public libraries and also school libraries, where they ban books. Tell us a little bit about this and then the backlash or the pushback.
Yeah, so this is a topic that has been even more elevated, especially with the political wrangling that's happening ahead of the 2022 election, but also heading into the 2024 election. And that is, what types of materials are available at public libraries or at school libraries. We've seen stories even here in Springfield, for instance, of a controversial book that is available at a school library called Gender Queer. And some parents have objected, not just locally, but also across the country, to similar issues of these types of books that might explain or portray a certain lifestyle in a way for younger people to consume that material. There's concerns from parents that don't want to see these types of books on the shelves at their local school library. And there's been efforts, and you've seen the stories as well, of some raucous school board meetings in various parts of the country where parents might speak up. We don't necessarily have to go down the rabbit hole of talking about what the Department of Justice has done about parents and how they've characterized parents in certain situations. But regardless, it's obviously a very divided issue as to what kinds of materials should be available. Well, earlier this year, the Illinois Secretary of State, Alexi Giannoulias, who was newly elected after the former Secretary of State, Jesse White, didn't seek re-election, Giannoulias led the efforts to get a measure passed to be the first in the nation to restrict state grant dollars from the Secretary of State's office, which manages funds for libraries across the state. He's the state librarian. He keeps track of all the various bills and laws and the state register for codes and administrative rules. He keeps and maintains all of that, but he also assists in the funding efforts of local libraries. So the Secretary of State's office sends out grants to local libraries on a variety of things, be it new technology or per capita grants and these types of things. But he spearheaded an effort earlier this year to get a measure in state law, the first in the nation, that says if a library does not follow the Library Bill of Rights from the American Library Association, they could have state grant dollars withheld. And that includes not banning books because of political or some other doctrinal type of belief. And it passed both chambers. The governor signed it earlier this week with a ceremony up in Chicago, and a lot of applause for that from those in attendance at that event. But it was a partisan vote. Not one Republican voted for the measure. And during debates about this, one of the really strongest arguments I think that Republicans solidified around was it takes away local control. You have local library districts where board members are elected by the local voters. You have local school districts that have members voted to a board accountable to the local people. And Republicans said this measure would restrict state tax dollars from those local library districts if the local people want to make sure that certain materials aren't widely available in circulation for various audiences. So you can see how quickly this really does turn into a very divisive issue in as far as whether or not state tax dollars should be withheld from public libraries for the policies that they implement. Another criticism was that the American Library Association is not elected by these taxpayers in local library districts. It's a third-party non-government organization, and people seem to be critical of the idea of just rubber stamping whatever this non-elected third-party national organization does. So again, a very, very divisive issue.
Spent my entire life in journalism defending the First Amendment. We don't get into too much opinion here, but banning books at regular general libraries, I'm certainly not in favor of that. But when it comes to school libraries, when it comes to the material that's available to our elementary school children, for example, I can see why parents would be concerned about that. I've seen pages that are included in the book that you mentioned, Gender Queer. It's not just a word book. There are images and graphics, and some of them depict very explicit sexual activities. Could there not have been a differentiation between school libraries and general public libraries? Was that not even discussed? What insight do you have there, any?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when they craft legislation, surely that's something they debated. But when it comes to the last minutes of the overall debate, I think it really came down to just the overall question of, regardless of the library, this measure seems to take away that local control and really just requires a rubber stamp of the ALA Bill of Rights, and some people had enough objection to it, especially across the Republican side of the aisle, that not a single Republican vote was made.
Well, we'll see what happens next. Will school districts just defy state government and refuse their money, particularly in more conservative areas, and continue refusing to put some of these books on the shelves? I don't know. We'll see. Time for one last topic, Greg. It's something we have talked about before, but is now law and has now been challenged. And that was the legislation that the General Assembly passed and Governor Pritzker signed, restricting where lawsuits filed to challenge certain state laws on constitutional grounds, state constitutional grounds, can be filed to just two counties, Cook County in Chicago and Sangamon County in Springfield. There has been a challenge already filed to that. Tell us about that.
So this measure passed before the legislature adjourned, and it was modified once and then went through both chambers and ultimately got onto the governor's desk, and he signed it last week. And it was ultimately a bill that the sponsor said was to combat what they characterized as frivolous lawsuits, challenging state laws on constitutional grounds or challenging executive orders on constitutional grounds, and not allowing for individuals to file their complaints in their local jurisdiction, not any of the 100 counties, but only 2 of 102 counties. And that means that if somebody down in Cairo, Illinois, deep South Illinois, they have to travel to Springfield, 150 plus miles or so. I'm not sure the exact distance, but it's a long drive to get to Springfield to file in Sangamon County. Or they can go up to Chicago and file in Cook County, but not in their local county, right in their backyard. So this ultimately passed with supporters saying it's necessary to not waste the Attorney General's resources in defending these challenges. But the opponents equated it to tyranny and said that it essentially is reminiscent of King George III by, the king passing unconstitutional laws, charging people with those things, and then having them have to travel across the sea to go face court. And the debate was obviously pretty heated. It was along party lines. It passed both chambers, gets on the governor's desk, he signs it. Well, I talked with attorney Thomas Magg and was discussing some other things. He's been involved in challenging the state's gun ban. He filed that in Crawford County. That was ultimately transferred to federal court. But Magg, he has a separate case that he filed down in Madison County, and it challenges the state's law of the firearm owner identification card on constitutional grounds. That's count 1. It's a case of a guy who had a prior marijuana conviction, and Magg says previous federal rulings elsewhere throughout the country say that nonviolent marijuana users do have a Second Amendment right. I'm sure that's still being adjudicated, but that's the basis of count 1 of Magg's charge in Madison County. Count 2, he says, goes directly after this, and he challenges the state law of limiting the venue of which people can go file. And he ultimately dares the Illinois Attorney General to try to remove that challenge from Madison County to either Cook or Sangamon County. So I imagine we'll be tracking this and watching exactly what happens here, because this is obviously going to end up in the Illinois Supreme Court and very well could be up into the U.S. Supreme Court. So more litigation, Dan, that I'm going to be tracking. My Pacer account, I'm sure, is hitting the corporate credit card pretty hard.
I was going to say, Greg, don't you have enough court cases that you have to keep track of? The gun ban?
Yeah.
We're still waiting on the cashless bail.
Yep.
To wind down.
I'm working on that story. Trust me. Yeah, we've got some rulings that are being handed down, but have yet to see any ruling on the no cash bail, and have yet to see any ruling on the gun ban challenge in the Illinois Supreme Court. So we'll see just how long it takes for the courts to deal with this challenge, limiting where people can file constitutional challenges against the state.
Well, look forward to reading that continued coverage. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.